Ecce Homo. We're not talking about gays today. This is Latin for here is the man. It's a title of a very famous painting. Many artists have depicted this scene. I went through and looking for images on the internet, and boy, there's a lot of people who've painted this scene. Most European painters are very polite about it. They don't show much blood and gore. And incidentally, they make them very white-skinned. I guess it's to show purity or something. I'm not sure what they were doing. The Spanish are not so squeamish about it. They're more honest about what Jesus went through. And then in Israel, there's this fabulous stained glass window in a church called the Church of the Flagellation. I think it's probably a Station of the Cross kind of church. I was just amazed. I looked close at it. You can't see it really here, but it's well done. But what interests me is not so much how Jesus looked, but what was going on amongst the characters. And once again, we've been working our way through John, and we've been doing Easter now for weeks and weeks. We're going to do some more Easter. But John is real succinct in his storytelling. It's almost like he does an outline, but with thought and study, you can look underneath the words and understand a profound warning about religion in this passage. This story is not just about a miscarriage of justice. It's like Ezekiel 34. It's about religious leaders who slaughter the flock and scatter them. And yet here, a pagan ruler tries to save the Lamb of God. This is what John is showing us. But before we read our part of the story today, let's review where we are in the plot. We all know the plot, but okay, the religious rulers had nabbed Jesus, took him to the high priest, where Jesus admitted that he was the Son of God. So that was blasphemy, so they condemned him to death and dragged him over to Pilate to be crucified. Now, they didn't tell Pilate their real objection because that was a religious objection. Pilate wouldn't care about that. He wouldn't care that Jesus claimed to be God. They only told him that Jesus claimed to be a king. So Pilate interviewed Jesus and found out that, yeah, he did claim to be a king, but a king not of the Roman Empire. He was a king from another place. But Pilate couldn't get him to tell him where this other place was. But at any rate, he could see there was no threat to Rome and didn't deserve crucifixion, so he told the religious leaders that he planned to release Jesus. And they had a fit. Then Pilate tried again to release Jesus by suggesting that this Passover custom that they had of releasing a prisoner, he could release Jesus, and that would save face because then Jesus wouldn't have to be declared innocent, and they could be guilty and it wouldn't matter. But they had a fit again. They wanted Barabbas, and he was a rebel and a revolutionary and a murderer. So Pilate's second plan didn't work either. So now he comes up with a third plan to get Jesus released, and that's our story for today. Let's read this account. The account of Ecce Homo. Here is the man, John 19, 1-12. And I'm reading from our Pew Bible if you want to follow along. If you don't, that's fine too. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers also twisted together a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and threw a purple robe around him. And they repeatedly came up to him and said, "Hail, King of the Jews!" and were slapping his face. Pilate went outside again and said to them, "Look, I'm bringing him outside to you to let you know I find no grounds for charging him." And then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." When the chief priests and temple police saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate responded, "Oh, take him and crucify him yourself. I find no grounds for charging him." "We have a law," the Jews replied to him, "and according to that law he must die because he made himself the Son of God." And when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid than before. He went back to headquarters and asked Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus didn't give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "You're not talking to me? Don't you know I have the authority to release you and the authority to crucify you?" "You would have no authority over me at all," Jesus answered him, "if it hadn't been given to you from above. This is why the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." And from that moment on, Pilate made every effort to release him. Now, Pilate might have thought that these Jewish religious leaders were maneuvering to get released of this rebel, this Barabbas, because he was going to take over Rome or something. That's what Pilate may have thought. So this new plan was to punish Jesus, satisfy their charge of pretending royalty, and then he hoped to be able to release him. Pilate knew that Jews normally railed against these harsh Roman punishments, but he hadn't figured on the real reason these religious leaders wanted Jesus crucified. Pilate only knew that they were jealous of his fame. He didn't know they accused him of claiming to be a god. So Pilate didn't take into account the religious fury that's the worst kind of evil. This kind of religious fury justifies the most diabolical punishments, and the people who do it think it's righteous anger. So let's look at some details. The original readers of this gospel understood a lot of things that we don't really understand, and we're going to look at some of these things, little interesting details. First, let's look at this punishment meted out by Pilate's orders. The Romans used 3 levels of flogging. The least, fustigatio, was a whipping, accompanied by a stern warning not to repeat the offense. Latin words. Flagellatio was a real scourging, a real beating to bring a prisoner into submission. The third, verberatio, could result in death because it exposed the bones and even the entrails of the victim. Yeah. Verberatio was reserved usually for victims who were going to be crucified because it shortened the time on the cross. Sometimes they even died on the whipping post. Now, commentators don't really know which of these things Jesus suffered under. It seemed to me that there may be 2 floggings, and a couple of the commentators have suggested this. The first one, like this painting, was probably flagellatio, that middle one, just to appease the religious rulers with some blood and some bruises, but not so much as to threaten Jesus' life because he had intended to release him. Then, before his crucifixion, as was customary with crucifixions, Jesus was given that verberatio, so he could barely stand, couldn't carry his cross, and died soon after being nailed to his cross. Next, verse 2. We see the soldiers playing with their prisoner. Now, they often played games when they were bored. Soldiers, lots of downtime. And so they played knuckles and games. And so Jesus, this King of the Jews, presented an interesting opportunity for games for them. Just reminded me of those pictures from Abu Ghraib where the soldiers were laughing at this pile of naked prisoners. It's the same kind of mindset, messing around, joking around with the prisoners. The Roman soldiers thought it'd be hilarious to give these Jews, these despised Jews, their king. So they found an old military robe in a particular shade of dark red purple. We know exactly what color this is because Reba and a few of the rest of us were at lunch just talking about this particular color of red, and whether it was purple or whether it was dark red. We had it going back and forth. And so we know exactly what color this thing it was. Dark, reddish, purpley red. It's like that. But what it is, it's a royal color. And so that's the whole idea that John is showing us. This is a color of royalty, that ironically, they were telling the truth, that Jesus is the King of the Jews. Now about that crown of thorns. Most artists seem to want to paint this little crown that looks like it's thorns from a blackberry bush or something, all wound around, sort of like a prickly headband. But I don't think that's what it was. I think the thorns the soldiers got were from an acacia tree or a palm tree. Now, I don't know if you've seen these things. I used to live in Florida and trim my mom's palm tree, and man, these things are this long and sharp as needles, and they hurt, and they stay hurting after you've poked yourself with them. They're sharp as needles and long, and I think that's what the soldiers were using. Now, a few commentators have an interesting alternative view of the way the soldiers might have fashioned this crown. Crowns like this were usually made of leaves, laurel leaves, or some kind to honor an athlete, or even a crown for royalty. But it's interesting, when they did it for crown for royalty, they did these thorns so they'd stick out like this. And so it would be like a radiation around their heads. And so it could be that the crown of thorns on Jesus was more like this Spanish pageant, where it was stuck up like that, but also poking into his head, kind of maybe both. A kingly crown, a winner's wreath of thorns. Then the soldiers paid mock homage to this ridiculous king. And that reminded me of a high school prank. I was bullied in high school, and so this is riveted into my head. You go to shake hands with somebody, they're going to be real friendly and shake hands with you. Instead, they grab your finger and bend it back. Did you ever have that happen to you? Well, that's the kind of trick these soldiers were doing, because they'd bow their knees in homage to the king, and then they'd rise up with a salute and backhand him like that. So they'd beat him, pretending to give him homage. And then they would laugh uproariously. I don't know if you've ever been in that situation. I hope not. Well, by the time they grew tired of their game, Jesus was bruised and bloody. He was a mess in this royal robe and crown, and they gave him this silly little reed to hold like a scepter, until Pilate eventually called for him again. Now, Pilate, he seems to have a talent for drama. I think most of these rulers of Rome probably had to have a talent for drama. So he lectures the crowd for a while, and then sarcastically reveals their king and announces, "Here is the man," in Ecce, Homo, and Jesus is pushed out, this pathetic wannabe king in his robe and crown and little old scepter. And John wants us to remember Jesus called himself the Son of Man, his title as King of all humanity. Here is the man. Second Adam. Pilate thought that surely, after seeing this Roman mockery, the scruples of these religious rulers would surely move them to pity and anger at the Romans. Nope, it just stimulated their bloodlust. The priests go nuts. Give us a crucifixion. Yeah, that's what we want. I want blood. Now notice what's happened here. Up to now, John has kind of been blaming the crowd. Now he shows us who's really in charge and responsible. He blames the priests. They have no scruples at all. Religion. Okay, so now Pilate's done with him, with these nasty people. He says, okay, fine, do it yourself. Stone him or whatever your religion requires you to do. And then the religious rulers drop the bomb on Pilate, something he hasn't known that they've hidden, that Jesus claims to be the Son of God. Oh man, now Pilate figures he knows where Jesus is from, where his kingdom is, and he's scared to death. Pilate may not be a religious man, but he is a superstitious man, and he's heard these stories of gods coming and pretending to be people so they can do whatever they want to the people. And Pilate has just had the Son of God flogged and mocked. Pilate figures he's in deep trouble. So in verse 9, He escorts Jesus back inside where he pleads with Jesus to tell him where he comes from. Where is your kingdom? Jesus doesn't answer. You can hear the sound of crickets. Finally, Pilate just explodes. He's the boss. These people are all bossing him around. He's the one who lives or dies. Jesus, are you so stupid? Don't you know what I can do to you? Then Jesus stokes his fear another notch. He tells Pilate that, Pilate, you're not so hot. You don't have any power at all. The power you have comes from God, my Father. Well, then Jesus does let him off the hook a little bit. He talks like the God he is and assures Pilate that he's not as guilty as he fears, because Pilate has really been given no choice here. He's been outmaneuvered by Caiaphas, the high priest, the one who handed him over. Instead of Pilate, Caiaphas will feel the wrath of God. Caiaphas has usurped his office, carried out his duties to his own advantage and enrichment, used his office to intimidate his people and steal from the most vulnerable among them, all in the name of God. Caiaphas and his priests will pay. So now Pilate's at his wit's end. He's convinced he has to figure out how to get Jesus released. But he has no power over these religious rulers. He's tried 3 times already to release Jesus and been outwitted each time. Now remember, when the Bible repeats something 3 times, it means it's really important and you better listen. Pilate has tried to release Jesus 3 times, but been thwarted each time by corrupt religious leaders. That's a most important point. As ruthless as Pilate is, and he was very ruthless, John is going easy on him. The other writers of the Gospels didn't go easy on Pilate, but John does. John sees Pilate as a victim of unscrupulous, wicked religious leaders. John is warning his people, his own church, is warning them not to follow such religious leaders. And apparently there were several of them, many of them, in the early church. Even in the time of Paul, which was before the time of John, we read about some of these fakers who try to take people captive with attractive alternatives to the gospel of Christ. Some tried to get Christians to follow all those Jewish rules of the Old Testament. Some of them even went back to the synagogue. Some were tempted to live in sensuality and pursuit of wealth, as if that was Christianity. Some were tempted to view themselves as far more enlightened than normal people with special knowledge that many people don't have. Some used their Christian background as a selling point on their resume. A religious person can do the most horrendous things in the name of God. It takes all the inhibitions away to say, God told me to do it. We've seen this with people murdering abortion doctors. God told me to do it. And even the pro-life people say, don't do that. We should also heed this warning as we see it. There are many religious people trying to promote themselves using their religion. When a business or a politician promotes themselves on the basis that they're a card-carrying Christian, you better run the other way because they're scamming you. If that's all they have to sell their product or their candidacy, they're scamming. A truly religious person will not try to take that kind of advantage of the religion because it just amounts to selling their faith on the market. You know, I've been wondering about this TV evangelist. You probably heard of him, Jim Bakker, years ago. him and his wife, they were fleecing their audience to build this huge religious empire with an institution and all this stuff. I wonder what he was up to now. He was out of jail. He's been out of jail for a while, and I wonder, what is he doing? Well, he's got another scam going, and he seems to target Christians. We're a trusting kind of people, and so we fall easily for people who are, I don't know, charismatic or something, and promising stuff, and we believe them. And okay, so he's going on. At the end of the world is nearly here, and you need to stock up your pantry to protect yourself against the end of the world coming. So you need to buy food. And guess whose food you need to buy? Jim Bakker's food. It's a scam. It's a religious scam. And politicians, some people running for office try to impress Christians with their credentials for righteousness. Let's vote for people who are serious about justice and mercy and peace and economic prosperity, whatever way you think that might work out. But let's steer clear of people who use their religion to their advantage. They're scamming us. Like that, let's steer clear of businesses that use Jesus to sell their products and services. A friend of mine once said this, and I think it might be true. He says, I will never do business with people who advertise themselves as Christians because they're just horrible to work with. I hated to hear that. But why else would you advertise yourself as a Christian if you didn't have anything else to advertise yourself as? What are you doing? You're trying to scam people. Let's do business with people who live as Jesus wants them to live through their business, in honesty and integrity and, like a good businessman, a good business person. Let's be careful out there. Let's steer clear of people who use religion. We've seen what it can do. The most horrendous things. Live as Christ wants us to live, and follow those kind of people. Amen.